Noah Thorntoneath, a frigid twilight, Eric Caldwell hears a cry from the deep woods. Not human, but desperate. He steps forward, each move heavy with fate. Will he find life or death in the eyes awaiting him? This tale will leave you breathless. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Let's get into it. The biting cold of Montana's wilderness wrapped around Eric Caldwell as he pushed through the dense forest, his boots crunching over layers of hardened snow. At 75, Eric no longer moved with the speed he once had. His frame was slightly hunched, but his hands remained steady. Weathered from decades of woodworking and laboring Noah Thorntoneath open skies. The solitude of the Caldwell's wilderness suited him well. It had been his sanctuary ever since Clara, his wife of 45 years, had passed away 3 winters ago. Their cabin, tucked between towering pines and overlooking a frozen creek, had become a place of quiet contemplation, filled with the scent of sawdust and the lingering echoes of memories. He wasn't quite ready to let it go. Eric's days followed a familiar rhythm, chopping wood for the stove, carving intricate patterns into reclaimed timber for furniture, and trekking along the winding trails that cut through the forest like veins. It was during one such walk, late in the afternoon, that a deep guttural sound shattered the stillness. Eric halted mid-step, the axe slung over his shoulder momentarily forgotten. The growl carried a distinct note of pain, reverberating through the trees. He scanned the area, squinting against the dim gray light filtering through the barren branches. The sound came again, a raw mixture of a growl and a whimper. Eric's heart pounded. He knew that sound well. Years spent in these woods had taught him the unmistakable cry of a bear. Caution tempered his curiosity as he tightened his grip on the axe handle. Moving carefully, Eric followed the sound, his boots pressing deliberate prints into the snow. The forest, once peaceful, now thrummed with tension, the distant calls of crows adding an eerie soundtrack to his search. It wasn't long before he found the source, a large black bear, partially obscured by brush. Her massive frame rose and fell with uneven breaths, her dark eyes locking onto him with a mix of defiance and desperation. Eric's gaze dropped to her front leg, and his stomach clenched. The bear's paw was trapped in the cruel grip of a rusted steel trap, blood seeping into the snow Noah Thorntoneath her. She let out a weak snarl as he approached, her muscles trembling from pain and exhaustion. For a moment, every survival instinct Eric had screamed at him to turn back. Yet something about her vulnerability held him in place. He'd seen injured animals before, elk with broken antlers, foxes limping through the frost. But this felt different. There was intelligence in her eyes, a flicker of understanding that softened the wild fury he had expected. Eric spoke gently, his voice steady despite the tight knot in his chest. "I'm not here to hurt you, girl. Let's figure this out together." The bear growled again but didn't lunge, her strength clearly waning. Eric took a cautious step closer, keeping his movements slow and his voice calm. From his satchel, he pulled out the small loaf of bread he had baked that morning. Tearing off a piece, he tossed it toward her. She sniffed the offering, her nostrils flaring as hunger momentarily eclipsed her pain. Eric tossed another piece before kneeling a few feet away to examine the trap. It was old, rusted, and brutally efficient, its jagged teeth biting deep into her flesh. He swallowed hard, wiping his palms on his coat before gripping a sturdy stick. Using the stick as a lever, he wedged it Noah Thorntoneath the trap's release mechanism, his hands trembling as he applied pressure. The trap resisted, groaning under the strain, and Eric's breath came in sharp bursts, visible in the icy air. Finally, with a metallic snap, the trap's jaws released their grip. The bear withdrew her injured paw with a sharp intake of breath, retreating a few steps but not running. Eric stayed crouched, his body taut, waiting for her next move. She stared at him, her dark eyes still watchful but no longer wild. Blood dripped from her paw onto the snow, and Eric resisted the urge to reach for her, knowing it would break the fragile trust forming between them. After a long moment, the bear turned and limped into the trees, her silhouette disappearing into the twilight. Eric exhaled a shaky breath, sinking onto a nearby log, his limbs trembling with the adrenaline of the encounter. As the forest settled back into its familiar rhythm, Eric rose and made his way home. The walk felt longer than usual, each step weighed down by the memory of the bear's eyes and the unspoken connection they'd shared. Back at his cabin, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, but the heat did little to soothe Eric's restless mind. He replayed the moment over and over, the trap, the bear's growls, the silent understanding that passed between them. Something about it felt significant, though he couldn't yet articulate why. That night, as the wind howled softly against the cabin's wooden walls, Eric lay awake, the bear's eyes lingering in his thoughts, like a quiet plea for compassion he hadn't realized he was capable of answering. The days after Eric Caldwell's encounter with the bear passed in a strange rhythm. The quiet of his cabin, once a comfort, now seemed charged with an expectant energy he couldn't quite explain. He spent his mornings as usual, chopping wood, tending to his small vegetable garden, and working on a rocking chair he had promised to a neighbor last spring. But his thoughts frequently strayed to the forest, to the bear he had freed, and to the way her eyes had seemed to linger on him before she disappeared into the trees. He told himself it was unlikely he would ever see her again, but the memory of her dark, watchful gaze remained vivid, refusing to fade into the ordinary haze of passing days. It was during one of these mornings, as Eric worked on the rocking chair in his workshop, that he heard it, a deep, guttural sound carried faintly on the crisp winter air. He paused, his chisel hovering above the smooth curve of wood, straining to listen. The sound came again, low and resonant, unmistakably a bear's growl. Eric set down his tools, wiping his hands on his flannel shirt as he stepped outside. The sunlight was pale, filtering weakly through the skeletal branches of the pines, and a chill breeze swept through the clearing. Eric scanned the tree line, his pulse quickening when he spotted movement. Emerging cautiously from the shadows was the black bear, her powerful frame limping slightly as she approached. But this time, she wasn't alone. Two smaller shapes flanked her, their movements hesitant and curious. Cubs. Eric blinked, stunned. They were smaller than he would have expected, their fur thick and scruffy, one nearly jet black, while the other had a faint brownish tint around its ears and paws. The mother bear paused at the edge of the clearing, her injured paw raised slightly off the ground, her cubs pressing close to her sides. Eric's heart thudded as he took a step forward, his breath misting in the air. The bear growled softly, not a warning, but a sound that seemed more like a statement. She lowered her head into Eric's utter disbelief. She dropped something onto the ground. It gleamed faintly in the sunlight, a fish freshly caught and still glistening with water. Eric let out a soft, incredulous laugh, his voice unsteady. "You've got to be kidding me." The bear watched him, her massive head tilting slightly as though gauging his reaction. Her cubs shifted nervously, their small bodies tensing with each twitch of her ears. Eric approached slowly, his boots crunching in the snow, and stopped a few feet away from the fish. He crouched, his movements deliberate, his voice low. "You brought this for me?" He didn't expect an answer, of course, but the question felt natural. The bear didn't move, her dark eyes steady on his. Eric picked up the fish, its cold, slippery texture grounding him in the surreal moment. He held it up slightly in a gesture of gratitude, then stepped back to allow the bear her space. The cubs, emboldened by his retreat, began to sniff around the clearing, their stubby legs awkwardly navigating the uneven snow. One cub stumbled over a small log, letting out a surprised yelp before scrambling to its feet. Eric chuckled, the sound warm and unbidden, and to his amazement, the mother bear seemed to relax slightly. She let out a low huff, nudging the clumsier cub gently with her nose, before turning her gaze back to Eric. He stood still, unsure of what to do next, until the bear took a slow step backward, then another, her cubs following her lead. Eric watched as they disappeared into the forest, their shapes melting into the shadows as seamlessly as they had appeared. For a long moment, Eric stood there, the fish still in his hands, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He knew animals exhibited intelligence. He had watched ravens solve puzzles and deer navigate obstacles. But this was something else entirely. The bear had remembered him, sought him out, and offered a gesture of gratitude that felt almost human. It was humbling and unsettling in equal measure, A reminder of how little he truly understood about the creatures he shared this wilderness with. That evening, Eric prepared the fish for dinner, feeling a twinge of guilt as he cooked it over the wood stove. He wasn't sure if it was because the fish felt like a gift too sacred to consume, or because it served as a tangible reminder of the connection he had forged with the bear. Either way, the meal tasted different, richer somehow, as though the forest itself had offered him a share of its bounty. After eating, Eric sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting back to the clearing and the cubs' tentative exploration. He felt a strange pang of longing, a desire to see them again, to understand more about their lives and the bond they shared with their mother. It was foolish, perhaps, to grow attached to wild animals, but the thought refused to leave him. Over the next few days, Eric found himself looking out toward the tree line more often, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He began leaving small offerings at the edge of the clearing, apples, nuts, and occasionally scraps of bread he had baked. He wasn't sure if the bear would return, but something in him needed to make the gesture. It felt like an acknowledgement, a way of saying, "I see you, I respect you." At first, the offerings went untouched, the snow around them undisturbed. But one morning, Eric noticed faint paw prints leading to the pile, and the food was gone. He smiled to himself, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. As the days turned into weeks, the visits became more regular. The mother bear, whom Eric began calling Luna, would sometimes appear at the edge of the clearing, her cubs trailing behind her. They never ventured too close, but Eric didn't mind. He spoke to them softly, his voice carrying across the still air, and watched as the cubs grew bolder, darting a few steps forward before retreating to their mother's side. Luna, for her part, seemed to tolerate his presence, her massive frame radiating a calm strength that Eric found both awe-inspiring and oddly reassuring. In those moments, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the forest and the unexpected company of his wild neighbors, Eric felt a sense of connection he hadn't known he needed. The grief that had clung to him since Clara's passing began to loosen its hold, replaced by a fragile but growing hope. Life, he realized, had a way of surprising you when you least expected it, weaving threads of meaning through even the quietest corners of existence. For the first time in years, Eric found himself looking forward to what the next day might bring, and the thought filled him with a warmth that rivaled even the coziest fire. The wind howled around Eric Caldwell's cabin, shaking its wooden walls and rattling the windows as the first signs of a fierce storm descended upon the Montana wilderness. The sky, heavy with an ominous gray, pressed down on the treetops as snow fell in relentless sheets, quickly blanketing the forest in a smothering layer of white. Inside, Eric stoked the wood stove, feeding it another log as the flames crackled and threw dancing shadows across the room. He was no stranger to winter storms. They were a part of life out here, their isolation both a challenge and a comfort. But tonight something felt different, a tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was his anticipation of seeing Luna again, her visits now as much a part of his days as his morning coffee. He shook the thought away, pulling a quilt over his legs as he settled into his armchair. The storm intensified as darkness swallowed the cabin. Snow battered the windows with increasing ferocity, and the wind howled like a living thing, its cries echoing through the trees. Eric had just begun to doze when a sudden sound jolted him awake, a frantic scratching at the door, urgent and insistent. Cutting through the storm's fury, his heart leapt. For a moment he thought it might be the wind playing tricks on his ears, but then it came again, more desperate this time. Throwing off the quilt, Eric rose, his pulse quickening as he approached the door. He pulled it open, and the icy wind slammed into him, stinging his face and stealing his breath. Standing in the swirling snow was Luna, her massive frame coated in frost, her dark fur matted with ice. Her growls were low and guttural, her eyes sharp with urgency as she pawed at the ground and glanced back into the storm. Eric barely had time to process the sight before she growled again, stepping back as if urging him to follow. "What is it, girl?" Eric shouted over the wind, his voice muffled by the roaring blizzard. Luna didn't wait for him to decide. She turned and began to limp into the forest, her gait uneven but determined, her head swinging back to ensure he was following. Eric hesitated only a moment before grabbing his coat, hat, and flashlight. He slung the cold slicing through his layers with a vicious precision. Luna led him deeper into the woods, her silhouette a dark blur against the unrelenting snow. The wind tore through the trees, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the muffled creak of branches Noah Thornton ding under the weight of ice. Eric stumbled as the snow deepened, each step a struggle as it dragged at his boots and numbed his legs. His flashlight beam danced wildly, barely piercing the storm's fury, but Luna's figure remained steadfast ahead, her growls urging him on. Eric's breaths came in sharp, visible bursts, his lungs burning with the effort, but he pushed forward, trusting her completely. Time seemed to stretch as they trudged through the storm, the forest an endless maze of white and shadow. Just as Eric began to doubt his strength to continue, Luna stopped abruptly, turning to face him. She let out a sharp, insistent bark before leading him off the faint path and into a small hollow where the storm seemed slightly less oppressive. At first, Eric saw nothing, his flashlight beam bouncing off the snow in chaotic flashes, but then he heard it, faint cries, thin and desperate, carried to him on the wind. He swept the light toward the sound, and his heart nearly stopped. Two small figures huddled Noah Thornton, beneath a crude shelter of branches, their forms barely visible under the layer of snow that had begun to bury them. A boy and a girl, their faces pale and their bodies trembling uncontrollably, clung to each other in a fragile heap. Eric moved quickly, his instincts overriding his shock. "It's okay," he called out, his voice shaking as he dropped to his knees beside them. The girl looked up first, her wide eyes glassy with fear and exhaustion. The boy remained limp, his head resting on her shoulder. Eric shrugged off his coat, wrapping it around both children as he pulled them closer. "I've got you now. You're going to be all right." Luna hovered nearby, pacing anxiously as her deep breaths sent clouds of steam into the frozen air. Eric spared her a quick glance, his gratitude wordless but palpable, before turning his attention back to the children. Their small bodies were like ice, their clothes soaked through and inadequate for the brutal cold. The girl tried to speak, but her teeth chattered so violently that her words were incomprehensible. "Save your strength," Eric murmured, his voice firm but gentle. "We'll get you warm soon." He lifted the boy first, cradling him against his chest before coaxing the girl to her feet. She stumbled, but Eric steadied her with a strong hand, his arm around her shoulders as he guided them back toward the faint path. The return journey was a blur of exhaustion and determination. Eric's muscles burned with the effort of carrying the boy while supporting the girl's stumbling steps. Luna walked alongside them, her presence a silent reassurance. Several times Eric felt the urge to stop, to rest, but the children's faint cries spurred him onward. Finally, the faint glow of his cabin's windows emerged through the storm, a beacon of hope in the unrelenting wilderness. Eric nearly sobbed with relief as he reached the porch, kicking the door open and ushering them inside. The cabin's warmth was immediate, the crackling fire casting golden light over the scene as Eric set the boy down on a pile of blankets by the hearth. The girl collapsed beside him, her small hands clutching at the fabric of the coat Eric had wrapped around them. He worked quickly, fetching dry towels and wrapping them in blankets, then heating a kettle of water for tea. Luna lingered by the door, her massive frame silhouetted against the firelight as she watched the children intently. Eric turned to her, his voice hoarse but full of gratitude. "You did good, girl, real good." As the children warmed, their color began to return, and the girl managed to croak a few words. "Ava Thornton," she whispered, pointing weakly to herself before nodding toward the boy. "Noah Thornton, my brother." Eric nodded, his heart twisting at the thought of how close they had come to being lost forever. "Ava Thornton. Thornton and Noah Thornton," he said softly, his hand brushing the boy's damp hair. "You're safe now." Restless Ava Thornton. Thornton's lips trembled into the faintest of smiles before her eyes fluttered shut. Eric turned back to Luna, who had finally stepped inside, shaking snow from her fur in heavy clumps. She huffed softly, her dark eyes meeting Eric's with an unmistakable sense of shared understanding. He knelt before her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "I don't know how you found them," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but you saved their lives tonight." Luna let out a low rumble, her head dipping slightly as if acknowledging his words. In that moment, Eric felt something profound settle in his chest. A connection not just to this remarkable bear, but to the untamed beauty and resilience of the wilderness itself. The blizzard that had raged through the Montana wilderness was a memory now, leaving a sparkling world of white in its wake. The sun, pale but persistent, hung low over the forest as Eric Caldwell stood on his cabin's porch, gazing out at the stillness that followed the storm. Inside, the cabin bustled with new life. Ava Thornton. Thornton and Noah Thornton, the children Luna had led him to during that harrowing night, were bundled in thick quilts near the fire, their laughter finally beginning to replace the shivering silence they had carried when Eric first brought them in. The siblings had warmed quickly, their strength returning with every bowl of broth Eric set before them and every kind word he offered. Their gratitude was as quiet as it was profound, communicated through shy smiles and hesitant nods. Yet it was Luna, the mother bear, who remained foremost in Eric's mind. She had not lingered long after the storm, retreating to the forest once she was sure the children were safe. Eric hadn't seen her since, but he knew that her absence was temporary. She had a way of appearing when he least expected it, and somehow he felt certain that their bond was unbroken. The news of the rescue spread quickly, carried to the nearest town by a ranger Eric had contacted to reunite the children with their family. Ava Thornton. Thornton and Noah Thornton had wandered from their family's cabin while their parents were distracted by preparations for the storm. When they didn't return, their parents had alerted the authorities, but the search was called off as the storm worsened. That Luna had found them in such a vast, unforgiving wilderness and led Eric to their hiding place seemed to many in town like an act of divine providence. For Eric, it was something simpler, yet no less miraculous. A bond formed between two living creatures, an unspoken understanding that transcended the boundaries between man and beast. The townsfolk, intrigued by the story of Luna's role in the rescue, began to visit Eric's cabin in small groups. Parents brought their children, young faces alight with curiosity and wonder, while older residents listened intently, their weathered features softening as Eric recounted the bear's quiet heroism. Eric was not used to such attention, having spent most of his life in solitude, but he welcomed it. Sharing the story felt like paying tribute to Luna, a way of ensuring that the depth of her actions was not forgotten. The children in particular seemed enthralled, their imaginations captivated by the idea of a bear who saved lives and returned acts of kindness. "Will she come back?" one small boy asked one day, his voice brimming with hope. Eric smiled, his eyes drifting toward the tree line. "If she does, it'll be on her own terms. She's a wild thing, not ours to hold on to, but she'll always be a part of this place." It wasn't long before the story reached beyond the boundaries of their small community. A journalist from the state newspaper arrived at Eric's door one crisp morning, notebook in hand and a camera slung over her shoulder. She listened carefully as Eric spoke, her pen flying across the page as he described Luna's first appearance, the moments of trust that had grown between them and the blizzard night that had brought them closer than ever. Her article, published a week later, painted a vivid picture of the bond between man and bear, and the story struck a chord with readers. Letters began arriving at Eric's cabin, handwritten notes from strangers who had read about Luna and been moved by her actions. Some shared their own encounters with wildlife, while others simply wrote to thank Eric for reminding them of the connection humans could have with the natural world. Eric read each letter carefully, his hands trembling slightly at the weight of their words. It was humbling to know that his quiet life, so far removed from the noise of the wider world, had resonated with so many people. As winter gave way to spring, the community decided to honor Luna's story in a way that would leave a lasting impact. A group of residents approached Eric with the idea of hosting a festival, one that would celebrate not only Luna's heroism, but also the importance of coexistence with wildlife. At first, Eric hesitated. He had never been one for grand gestures or public events, preferring the solitude of his cabin and the steady rhythm of his days. But as he listened to their plans, a gathering that would include educational talks, art displays, and fundraising efforts for local conservation initiatives, he found himself nodding. "If it helps people understand how important it is to respect and protect what's out there," he said, "then it's worth doing." The first annual Wild Heart Gathering Festival was held in late summer, its name chosen to reflect the awe-inspiring presence of Luna in the wilderness she called home. The festival was a modest affair by design, held in the town square under strings of lights and colorful banners. Eric was taken aback by the number of people who showed up, some traveling from neighboring states just to be part of the event. The gathering buzzed with activity, stalls displaying handmade crafts, a small stage set up for speakers, and a photo exhibit showcasing Montana's stunning landscapes and diverse wildlife. To his surprise, Eric was invited to speak. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, but he agreed nonetheless. Standing on the stage, the afternoon sun casting a gentle warmth over him, he scanned the crowd and took a steadying breath. "The first time I saw Luna," he began, "she was suffering, trapped in something designed to harm her. I could have walked away, but something made me stay." He paused, letting the words settle. "I think it was her eyes. They didn't just see me as a man, but as a part of this world, just like she is. What she did that night, leading me to those children, wasn't just instinct. It was something more. A connection, a reminder that we aren't so different from the creatures we share this land with. We all want to survive, to protect what we love. And if we can hold on to that understanding, maybe we can learn to coexist." The applause that followed was thunderous, but what Eric carried with him most were the conversations that came after. Parents approached him with their children, expressing gratitude for the inspiration to teach the next generation about conservation. A young artist gifted him a painting of Luna and her cubs, their figures brought to life with bold, sweeping strokes of color. Eric accepted it with a quiet, heartfelt smile. It had been years since his heart felt so full. As the seasons changed, Luna's visits became less frequent. Eric assumed her cubs had grown, venturing into new territories to start lives of their own. Still, he never stopped watching the tree line, hoping to catch a glimpse of her familiar silhouette. On quiet evenings, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, bathing the cabin in golden hues, Eric would sit on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee, thinking of her. She had altered his life in ways he never could have foreseen, filling the void left by grief with something deep and lasting. When Eric passed away many years later, the community came together to honor his legacy. Near his cabin, they planted a grove of aspens, naming it Caldwell's Refuge, a sanctuary for both wildlife and people alike. Visitors would come to reflect on the power of kindness and the delicate beauty of the natural world. And though Luna's footprints had long since disappeared from the snow, her presence lingered in the rustling leaves and the whispering wind, a silent testament to the bond between a man and the wild creature who saw him as something more than a stranger. The tale of Eric Caldwell and Luna isn't just a story of man and nature. It's a powerful reminder that compassion can bridge even the wildest divides. From the freezing depths of Montana's wilderness, where Eric locked eyes with a desperate Luna, to the heart-stopping moment she guided him through a raging blizzard to save two tiny lives. It's a symphony of survival and hope. Did you feel your pulse quicken when Luna brought Eric that fish? A silent thank you etched in her gaze? Or the lump in your throat when she trusted him enough to lead him through the dark to rescue Ava Thornton? Thornton and Noah Thornton. This isn't just a story. It's proof of the raw, unshakable power of connection, kindness, and resilience against life's fiercest storms. If this story stirred something in your soul, if you're hungry for more incredible journeys from the world around us, hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel right now. Every story is a doorway to the unexpected, and we want you with us on this ride. Drop a comment below. Do you think Luna ever came back to see Eric again? Share your thoughts, your emotions, and let's keep exploring the wonders ahead together.